But I really want to go back to the idea of local and how we can define local, because what we were saying is local in relation to an axis which is geographical, so local in terms of geography. But given the fact that we have all that technology, and we've seen the creation of now small groups on Clubhouse and other tools as well, and in a way, if we want to reinterpret the term local, they're still local, but the axis is no longer geographical. It could be thematic. It could be a group of people related to a theme, related to a cause, people working together perhaps in a company. So it could also be local at the level of the company in terms of cultural shift.
Absolutely, localism. Am I sounding? Is my microphone working? Okay, yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, okay. I think localism is, you're right, local, in that context, local could be redefined as political affiliations. It could be designed as you know, defined as social affiliations, whatever. It needn't be the town you're in, it needn't be geographical, but hyperlocalism, I think, is. And I think hyperlocalism, which, you know, that layer below local, is about connecting small groups of people with similar interests in a very specific area. And I think that's what's missing from the mix at the moment, and that's what I'm seeing to start to emerge. You know, is that a bunch of people in a certain area now get together and they effect change by going online, whereas before they thought, well, we can't change anything, we haven't got a voice. And I think that is a really interesting difference, because that really is geographical, and it's geographical in a way, I think, you know, yourselves, you know, you're much younger than me, and you probably haven't grown up and can't remember, but I grew up in that old industrial complex where people really did know everybody who was around them, and I think that's the point. I think things like WhatsApp have re-energized, for instance, the communications between people in the houses where I live. I live on an estate, and there are 20 houses. And when we moved in the 90s, I knew some of them. I knew most of them by sight, but I didn't really talk to most of them because I came here, went to work, came back, it was dark, you know, and there's no social side to what we do here. But since we've had a WhatsApp group, we've been talking enormously about everything. And while I might not have seen, you know, there's one person there I haven't physically seen for about 2 years, they're still in that group talking. And so we're forming a group opinion. And that, to me, is a good example of hyperlocalism. And I don't think I'm the only one. I think, you know, WhatsApp has enabled a lot more than people give it credit for. I think we're all members of WhatsApp groups for different things, and this, that, and the other. And I think the newer things coming out, you mentioned Clubhouse, you know, that's about like-minded people gathering together. But I think that's still an intelligentsia sort of service, if you like, people who think about it, whereas WhatsApp has achieved what Facebook achieved, and it's become a medium of mass exchange. And that's the significant difference really in the two, because Facebook, you know, WhatsApp really is something that, you know, your 90-year-old granny can use and does use. And they people finding that very easy, and they understood SMS text messaging. This takes it one step further. It allows you to form groups. I mean, that's basically the only difference if you think about it in terms of the user. So they've had a generation to get used to SMS text messaging. They've gradually upgraded their phones, and WhatsApp is such a light technical imprint on a phone that you can basically put it on anything. And people are using it, and families are saying, well, we can keep in touch via that, and so on. And so it's re-enabling those networks. I mean, when I left home to go to college, if I wanted to talk to my dad, you know, I had to queue up at a communal phone box, and wait my turn and put the money in, and then, you know, you've got people looking at you waiting to use the phone, etc., etc. And so you'd end up doing that once a week. And now, of course, with families, you're talking all the time. I'm in a 3-floor house at the moment. I talk to my kids on the top floor via WhatsApp. You know, but that's the point of the hyperlocalism. It's literally down to the ground level, the dot where you are. And I think there's you know, people are using it in the home. They're using it on their street, and I think businesses are starting to try and use that. I've seen local businesses, not necessarily WhatsApp in that case, but very close, tight networks that are related to a geographical thing, because I think our culture is often rooted in where we are. You know, my feeling is with culture that Britain has a particular culture because it's a northern country and it's on the edge of an Atlantic Ocean. It's dark for half the year, it's wet for the other half of the year, and for 2 days it's sunny. And I think that's why we drink a lot. You know, well,
it correlates with living in Finland. I've
yeah,
seen a
no,
lot
but
of
it's
the
exactly
same.
the same. The Finns, the Russians, the Swedes, all those countries that are dark drink quite a lot.
Yeah,
and that's
coffee
because it's
and
very
alcohol.
depressing in winter.
Yeah,
I think that's just an excuse, because if you compare it to like the people in the Mediterranean, like it's sunny half the time, if not 3/4 of the time, and they're still drinking. So
you're not
really
drinking you don't see the carnage that you see on British streets on a Friday night. Literally staggering groups of girls drunk and boys drunk and fights. I mean, if you've ever done, you know, a British provincial town on a Friday night, it's quite something. And I mean, I'm lucky. I've travelled the world, and I don't see that kind of behaviour in a lot of countries. The group drunkenness, you know, you see it with our football fans. You know, we invented hooliganism, you know, and that was partly because people went in groups and got drunk and went to football matches, and their tribal allegiance kicks in, you know, and it's all that stuff that unfortunately leads to war on a bigger scale. But yeah, but we do, and I do think Mediterranean countries drink a lot, but they drink it over a period of time, and I think there's a different culture there, and I think that's partly the weather. You know, the heat. You can't stand outside in the heat and get blind drunk on 10 pints of lager, because actually you feel terrible. And any Brit who's been on holiday to Spain will tell you that they feel awful when they've done that. And so they get smaller beers, they get half-size beers, not pints, and they take longer to drink and spend. So it changes, and I think in many other ways, you know, the culture is a product of where we are. Not all of it, obviously, but it's partly that. And I think what the tech's doing at the moment is giving us the ability to start being that local again, and to start recognizing our cultures, because these local groups I'm certainly part of are trying to recognize, you know, how to make the town a better place. Now, similarly, the mining town I grew up in, a very small mining town, it used to have a steelworks and two coal mines. All those shut down, and most people have been, you know, lots of people have been unemployed for a long time, and they're on badly paid, insecure jobs. And what I'm seeing there are groups springing up that are, it's quite interesting. That town and the people in it are focusing on the history of the town and trying to establish an identity again, having lost it. Whereas my local town here, which is in a much wealthier area of England, is about how do we reinvigorate the high street, because some of the shops are closing because of this, that, and the other. But both of them are about the identity of the place, but they're being expressed slightly differently. One is a longing for the past, and one is how do we make things fit for the future. And the past, of course, in the mining town had a great deal of certainty. You know, we had 200 years where there were plenty of jobs. You could just go from one job to another without worrying about it, etc., and all that's gone. Whereas the town I'm in at the moment is a very wealthy town on the edge of London. And we don't worry about jobs because we can access London and all the environment around London, and frankly, there are plenty of jobs. So you start to think, well, how do we make life better for ourselves here? And I think that's interesting, because that's hyperlocalism being expressed in two different ways. That are small groups of interested parties expressing their identity in slightly different ways. And the first group is, what did we used to have? We used to have stability. We had a great community, and they're always bemoaning the loss of community. Yeah, they are talking to each other in the same way they used to, just through an online medium. And similarly, you know, here, what's happened is we've had, you know, the large corporations move in over the last 30 years. You know, we've got locally, we have the head of, you know, the headquarters of Sony Sony Europe and GlaxoSmithKline and various other large companies have their European headquarters in this town. And it sort of pulled the localism away because people have moved into those organizations which have replaced the towns. I think in answer to your questions, actually, Brexit was a good example of hyperlocalism as used by politicians. I think, you know, one of the things that occurred with Brexit was that the small group of people who were really behind it understood, and this is to their credit in terms of their job, but not to their credit in terms of what happened. By the way, I don't like Brexit, but there you go. But you know, it is what it is, and it happened, and it was voted for, and all of that sort of stuff. So we live with it. But what they did very cleverly was actually they were hyperlocal in the way they campaigned, and they saw the power of Facebook to be hyperlocal in terms of delivering communications and ads. And so they went to, you know, for instance, they would target, you know, a fishing village that felt that the EU had somehow removed their wealth and their access to fish and so on through the fishing quota system. And they targeted those people and they said, the EU have caused hardship for you, you know, vote Brexit. We can take control and we can take our waters back and all of that sort of stuff. And they targeted specifically those towns, villages and groups of people. They didn't try and put a blanket national campaign on as such. The most effective bits of this were the hyperlocal things. And if you watch, there are many documentaries online you can watch about Brexit because actually it explains all of this and how they did it incredibly well, most of those documentaries. And I think politicians can learn a lot, but I also think ordinary people can learn a lot, and people in charge of the tech should be understanding what their platforms are being used for. Because actually it is almost mob mentality in some ways, because you persuade a small local group of people that particular injustice is happening and that the only way to fix it is this particular course of action. And then they don't seem to be able to take on board that it might not be true.
Yeah.
Because it's coming through. And this used to happen. You know, when I started, when I got to 18 and started going to pubs, there would always be someone in the pub who knew about things. And it must be true because, you know, David in the pub said so, and he knows about these things, and he's got an uncle who is in the army and they told them, you know, and exactly the same mechanisms are happening. You know, and they're powering Facebook misinformation and Twitter misinformation. But the campaign of Brexit was that hyperlocal campaign, and that was the success of it. And I suspect over the next few years we'll see a lot more of that. There may be more transparency on it in certain countries. Certain countries might insist on, you know, you've got limits on what you can do and things. But I think the hyperlocalism is nonetheless there because people are now starting to use these communities and groups in a genuine geographical sense. This is my town, this is my part of the town, and this is our group, and we are talking. This is my street, in my case, you know, I'm talking on my estate, 20 houses. And we talk about all sorts, and that is back to hyperlocalism. I think we used to have that. And I think what we've gone through is a period of globalization where the firms have all consolidated upwards and they've become mega corporations, and they're in every country, and they have a sort of network, and they work on their own sort of system, if you like. But that's pulled them away. I mean, it always makes me laugh when I see HSBC ads, because every country I go to, I see a HSBC bank ad, and it's exactly the same ad. It's just with a different language on. And when you look at the translation, it says the bank that thinks globally but talks locally, or something like this. And you think it's exactly the opposite. But they know, you know, that they need to appeal to people locally and say, oh yeah, that's a good British bank, or it's a good whatever. And I think, you know, honestly, I think Brexit, you have to sort of admire it. The campaigning for Brexit was genius online. Dominic Cummings in particular really grasped it. I mean, I despise the man politically. I think he was nasty, manipulative and harmful, but he nonetheless grasped that hyperlocalism thing. And so when you travel around Britain, and it's a good case study, you travel and you talk about Brexit, there are still people in very small areas who will hold the views they held, no matter what the evidence coming out. But that was genuine hyperlocalism, because they didn't have the national campaigns. Campaigns in the UK are limited, you know, in terms of the amount of money they can spend and so on. But of course, the online area is not regulated.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you can achieve those modular effects that way. Just get something that really scales.
It then addresses it as a system. So it's saying, well, if we can change the opinion in all these small areas, it builds up to one big opinion change.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it was a bit of a surprise when we got the leave the EU result on the referendum. However close it was a surprise, because I don't think anybody had read those systemic effects, the system effects going up the network.
Yeah.
They hadn't felt vibrations. Now, move ahead, hyperlocalism is also going to be useful in that way for communities, not just for political things.